And we are live. So, hi everyone, it's me, Laqwanda. Welcome again to Laqwanda's Heart and our live stream wellness series. I am here with a very special guest who is here to join me this evening. And tonight we are discussing structural oppression and emotional wellness in the Black community. And I know some of you are coming in. We have a ad that's playing, so we'll be waiting a little bit for you guys to come in. But tonight we have the amazing Enoch the Poet. I had the pleasure. Let me explain to you guys. I was at this mental health event, and they were doing poetry, and this man started speaking, and I was like, "Hold up, he's talking about some stuff that people don't talk about." I was like, he's mentioning some stuff. He's throwing some heavy punches here. And it was so captivating. I remembered him. I remember who he was. I remember his name. And I was like, when I decided to do this series, I say I have to find him and reach out to him because he was just that profound in his delivery, the message, the things that he was trying to convey. So I want to take out the time and the opportunity to introduce to you guys Enoch the Poet. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I cannot complain. Well, I mean, I could complain, but I'm not. I'm not going to. Life is cool.
Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. I want to give an opportunity for you to introduce yourself to everyone and to let us know who you are and just the things that you're into and the things that you're about. Obviously, by your name, we know that you are a wordsmith, but tell us about who Enoch the Poet is.
Yeah. So, as you said, I go by Enoch the Poet. I am born and raised on the north side of Wilmington, Delaware. I lived there my whole life up until about 2 years ago when I moved to Philly. I've been writing poetry probably since around like 8th grade. I'm 27 now, so I got a couple years under my belt. And I started performing officially, like pursuing poetry as a career path probably around 2016, 2017, and been going strong since. I have a book that is out for purchase called The Guide to Drowning. It came out in 2017, and it basically is an exploration of mental health within the Black community in terms of like looking at certain things that we would deem stressors and kind of capturing those small moments and unpacking those through poetic form. Aside from poetry, I'm a teaching artist with a nonprofit, and I basically get contracted to go into different schools, whether it be for a couple of months or for the entire school year, to lead workshops on various things from like identity politics to using poetry as a form of activism to using poetry as a form of rehabilitation. Um, yeah, that's pretty much my whole thing.
It always amazes me when I have people on and then they tell us about all the amazing stuff they're doing. They're like, well, that's it, that's it. But that is amazing. Thank you again so much for agreeing to join us tonight. So I want to dwell right into this because when we when I approached you and I asked you what it was that you wanted to talk about, what did you want to bring? Because I normally let people have free range of what they want to discuss. You came from a side that most people don't come from, and you wanted to talk about structural oppression and the emotional wellness in the Black community. And so when I was telling people, I was like, look, this dude is about to talk about some stuff. So just to kick us off, and for those who don't know or wondering, how do you see structural oppression and what brought you to that
Yeah, so I personally I define structural oppression as any system put in place that works against a marginalized community. But for me, that not only includes like political or economic systems, but it also includes like social systems. So, when I talk about economic systems, I'm talking about things like mass incarceration, poverty rates, things, and those tie into political systems as well, but also include social systems. So things like misogyny, patriarchy, and these are forms of structural oppression as well, because essentially every structure or system that is created is based off a way of thinking or a pool of ideology. So we can't talk about structural oppression by way of how it operates in an economic system without talking about the ways that it operates in an emotional and ideological system as well.
So you giving us some heavy hitters, So we're gonna, obviously, when we're talking about our community, the Black community, we're talking about communities that have experienced racism, segregation, complete disrespect, the lack of acknowledgement of being human, just trauma. And so when you're coming from this perspective of emotional wellness and structural oppression, link to the two for us tonight.
Yeah. So coming up in a low income environment, like I said, I was born and raised on North Side of Wilmington, which is like, a lot of people think that Delaware is just like this slow, small city and nothing ever happens. But Wilmington is definitely, it has all the same problems and traumas that are attributed to any low income city, right? You have the murder rates, you have the crime rates, you have the growing up in poverty stricken homes. And so by way of coming up in that environment, there were a lot of things that, I came in contact with that I didn't necessarily have the vocabulary to explain. And when I got to University of Delaware, which is where I graduated from, one of my professors and a good friend to me now, Dr. Yasser Payne, talked a lot about the ways that these things are tied to the greater American system. But not only that, the ways that us growing up in these types of environments can affect us emotionally. Like a lot of times, I think we focus so heavily on combating the system that we don't think about the ways that the system has damaged us. And so in starting to think about that, I got brought to this term of like mental genealogy, which basically describes the way that trauma moves through a family system. And basically it says, if, let's say, because I often talk about the fact that I have bipolar disorder. Let's say like I'm completely not born with that. Let's say I'm born completely neurotypical, which is like, neurotypical just means that I don't have any like mental or emotional ailments. If I go through a traumatic experience, one that most likely would be bred from interacting with structural oppression, and it affects me strong enough, it can shift my brain chemicals so that I develop depression, right? And then once I develop depression, it now becomes more likely to trickle down my entire family tree. So my kids become more likely to have it, my grandkids become more likely to have it, so on and so forth. And being a person of color, we're already, I think it's like, I want to say it was like 15 to 25% more likely to develop like emotional or mental ailments. And I think that ties directly to the fact that we grow up in these environments that are weighed down by the gravity of like all the oppression we come into contact with.
I think that hits a lot, especially when we look at adverse childhood experiences and how those impact the lives of our children, especially children of color, because those experiences are not taken into account when we're looking at behavior that is taking place in school systems. Those experiences are not taken into account when we're talking about the trauma that children experience on a daily basis, um, where we hear about violence that takes place in certain school systems, but then we don't address the fact that there's children who deal with violence every single day just getting to school. And when those children misbehave or act out because of the trauma that they're experienced, they are punished. Instead of supportive, because that child is viewed as being bad, as being disruptive. But if you saw Mr. Joe on the street every day, and you said hi to Mr. Joe every day, and then you heard that Mr. Joe got shot, or you heard the bullets that shot Mr. Joe, and then you're walking by where he used to stand and he's not there anymore, that has an effect on you, because you have a fear as a child, am I next? But our children don't seem to get that type of attention.
Yeah.
And they seem to be forgotten, as if somehow they're to blame for the violence in their communities that they're growing up in. And that bothers me. That bothers me deeply,
As it should.
because our children are ignored, their trauma is ignored. And for us, African Americans, the first point of contact for us in the mental health system is usually when we're already in crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then we're either faced with where we're going to a psychiatric hospital or we're getting put in handcuffs. If we live to get put in the handcuffs, because given the current culture of society.
Yeah, you might not even make it to that point. And it's
Go ahead.
So much of our understanding of what Blackness is has been cultivated in trauma. And so even when we talk about forming identity within like these oppressed spaces, it becomes hard to even do separate from whatever trauma I have. So it's like my understanding of myself becomes strictly based on how much pain I'm going through. And like that in itself is a whole other thing.
So when we're looking at our community and emotional wellness of our community, what would you say are like your top three? Let's pull three things to pull from this discussion. What would you say are the top areas where we're suffering, or where we're not striving because of this structural oppression that we're experiencing on a regular basis? Because it's at a point now where it's traumatizing for a lot of us to be Black, because we're having to have uncomfortable conversations about what to happen when the police pull you over, and people are having to invent things to put on your dashboard so someone won't think you're reaching back, to get something. So how do you see this affecting the emotional wellness of our community if you're looking at three different areas?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, I've gotten to a point when I first started really getting into poetry and using my poetry as a form of like social activism. A lot of what I was writing was geared towards addressing the system, addressing whiteness, addressing patriarchy, addressing all the things that, act upon us. And then I got to a point where I realized that essentially, as long as the people who are in power, like it's going to stay that way because they already know what's happening, right? Like this whole idea of like, if we put enough energy into showing them how problematic they are, they'll change. It's just, I personally just don't think it's true, because I think they know exactly what's going on, right? So at that point, in realizing that, my shift and ideology became not necessarily about addressing the whiteness and addressing the system, but addressing ways that we can learn to not even simply just survive, but progress within these things that are acting upon us, right? Because we've seen tons of people be successful without succumbing to the system. And I think part of it involves being honest with ourselves about the way these things affect us, right? Because it's such a large thing. The whole country is founded on these systems, right? So I think it's a much smarter battle to deal with yourself and your close-knit community first before dealing with like the larger thing at hand, right? And so I think number one is to identify the ways in which you have been affected or traumatized by these things. Once you identify those things, and I mean that in itself is like a hard first step, because a lot of us don't even want to have, when we talk about hard conversations, a lot of us don't even want to have those conversations with ourselves, let alone like other people, right? Because there's like a vulnerability there that I think eras like, you know, the civil rights movement, eras like slavery have kind of conditioned us to not be comfortable with, because prior we never really had the space to be vulnerable, because, you know, we were fighting for basic rights type of thing. And I mean, that fight is still going on, obviously, but, you know, the system has restructured itself so that it seems like we have at least the bare minimum. And so I think we have more space to address ourselves and more space to talk with ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I mean like us as individuals and us as like a greater community, to begin to point out the ways that we need the emotional healing. Because at the end of the day, like I can do all the external things that I want to do, right? I can strive for all these different positions and all these things, but if I'm not emotionally well, I'm gonna ultimately end up doing more harm to my community than good. So first and foremost, I think would be identifying the trauma.
You know, I think one thing I love about that is that, and we talked about this some last week, is like identifying the traumas, like, and how hard that is to speak what you've gone through, and not even to speak what you're going through, but to say how you're feeling about what you've gone through. Because our history as a people is just laced with all this strength that sometimes, and I want to say this in a way that people can understand, sometimes your strength can become your weakness, because you put up this, I am, you know, a byproduct of all these people who've held it together, then you too should be a person who can hold it together. And that if you can't hold it together, then something's wrong with you, you know? And so I think in that terms, that's when in our community, our strength becomes a weakness for us, because we're not allowing ourselves to feel. Because when you're trying to fight, when you're fighting for your rights, when you're fighting to live, when you're fighting to be acknowledged, when you're fighting, your culture is in survival mode. And you know, when you're in survival mode, that those basic needs, that's what you're trying to get met. And like you said, we are still fighting for a lot of things, and there's some leeway there where we can pay attention to, you know, those things, those inner things that are going on with us now. But I think we compare ourselves to our forefathers a lot, and we look at that and say we have to be that whole person, even though we don't know the battles and the demons that they were fighting. And that's the thing, we don't know that. And technology now has allowed us to know that we're not the only people dealing with things. Because you said, when you said that you have bipolar disorder, in my head, I was like, oh my God, me too.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's like, I think that sometimes there's a stigma about mental health within our community in general, right? That comes from like this, I would say this skewed view of what strength is, because even in a moment, it takes strength in itself to be vulnerable, right? It's just a different type of strength. And I think what you also said about us trying to like emulate our forefathers is like a very true thing. And it's almost to the point, or I won't even say almost, it is to the point where we are kind of like blind to the fact that there are a lot of things that didn't work, right? There are things that did work, of course, in like the grand scheme of things, but there are things on a microscopic scale that just didn't work, or else we wouldn't be traumatized, right? Like I hear people say all the time, you know, like, oh, that's the way my father did it, or that's the way my mother did it. And it's just like, yeah, that may be true, but did that work for you? Did you turn out the best version of yourself because that was acted on you? And a lot of times the answer is no, but we continue to like still do this thing because I think essentially it's much easier than taking the vulnerable route.
I have to agree with you yet again, you know, because we, you know, from when we're we're little babies, we're taught about who Martin Luther King is. And
Mm-hmm.
we're taught about Malcolm X, and we're taught about Medgar Evers, and we're taught about Fannie Lou Hamer, and we learn these people, and our mouths are open, and we're like, those are people, those are our culture. But at the same time, you know, we also have to acknowledge that it's okay if we acknowledge and experience our emotions, and it doesn't make us any less strong. I think, like you said, this skewed thing of what strength is, and we're constantly, our generation is constantly having to redefine and constantly having to say, you know, this is what strength is, and that when you are vulnerable and you are open and you are sharing, then not only are you showing strength, but you're also starting to break down those generational things.
Mm.
That silence of what happens in my house just stays in my house, or just suck it up, you know, because my mother dealt with a lot of stuff and she made it through, but I wouldn't want to make it through the way she did, because sometimes making it through isn't what you just want to do. Sometimes you have to want to do more than just make it through.
Definitely,
Because
definitely.
making it through isn't always the healthiest thing to do.
Yeah, and you can lose a lot of parts of yourself just making it through. And it's like going back, to what we brought up earlier about being in this constant state of survival. And it's just like that essentially is like just making it.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like we have so much potential to do more than survive regardless of the conditions. And that's not me saying that none of this structural stuff matters, because obviously, it does. But it's like, I'm just at a point where I'm not expecting any of these things to change. So my focus now is how can I best equip people of color to progress through all these systems without having to whitewash, without having to assimilate, without having to become a part of the system in order to survive. And I think it's very possible to move through these things if we learn the proper skill sets internally. And it's unfortunate that we don't have the same generational knowledge that a lot of white people have, right? We don't have financial literacy in our families in the same way that white people do. We don't have the emotional, well, I mean, I actually wouldn't say that white people have emotional literacy, but we don't have the space to express in the same way that they do. And it's just like we don't have the removed stigma of therapy that they do. There aren't many people teaching us, even within our close-knit family unit, how to process. there aren't many people teaching us how to step outside of a situation and analyze. And there definitely isn't that many people teaching us how to save money properly, right? And so it's like these are all things that we've never been taught, but they're also all things that we can introduce into the unit at any given point in time, given that somebody learns it. And that's all it really takes, is like one person in the unit to learn it. And then if they can spread that to multiple people, it can have like this ripple effect that lasts for a bunch of generations. Like, we often think about how small we are, and we think about it in a bad way, but thinking about how small we are also can teach us a lot about how much impact we have. Because if I'm 1 in a billion people and I learn something and spread that to 5 people, that spread that to 5 people, that spread that to 5 people, that spread that to 5 people, me being 1 in a billion just means that there's a billion other people that I can affect in some manner, that can ripple. And I think, going back to the 3 things, once we identify the trauma, we have to now figure out ways to not only heal it, but put healing in practice so that it can be passed down. Because it's one thing for me to get myself right, but now I have to be able to articulate that process to somebody else so that they can articulate it to somebody else, and so on and so forth.
When you were talking, especially in the beginning, when we were talking about, identifying the trauma, and now we're going, into healing so that we can pass it down, it really all is centering around this concept of community and the wellness of the community. And that was the one thing that I would say when we think about our forefathers and those who came before us, that's something they had down pat. Community was something that they had down pat. And I think that is a strength that it seems as we grow and we're moving on, that we tend to move away from. And it becomes this individualized, this I stuff versus what we're doing for the wellness of the community.
Yeah.
And that is the aspect of another thing that I have a problem with, because things used to be, just think about that ripple effect. You know what? Nobody's riding a bus. Nobody's riding a bus, and it was a community thing, because what was good for one was good for the entire community. And sometimes when we talk about our wellness, and it's a good thing that we talk about our wellness, because we understand that these conversations, as we have them, they have that ripple effect. So people can see reflections of themselves and hear stories that are familiar for themselves, so that they can understand that healing is available for them, and available for those after them. But what do you think is the barrier for when I, as an individual, I heal? What is the barrier for me to teach that to someone else? Why do you think that trickle down is not taking place the way that we need it to?
So I think I think a lot of these problems are like multifaceted, in the sense that there's just like so many different moving parts to each. And the reason it doesn't trickle down, I think, it can branch off to a lot of different things. When we talk about community in past years, with forefathers, I think it's kind of like a double-edged sword, in the sense that we definitely had community because our one goal was more apparent, because we were trying to get a minimum thing. But there were also a lot of communities inside the larger community that got kind of erased. And so now when we're in a time period where all of those communities have a voice, it's hard for us to move as one unit, because people can't people can't identify, not identify, people can't accept the blackness within other communities. Like when we talk about black people in the LGBTQIA community, when we talk about, you know, trans people being accepted, gay people being accepted, or so on and so forth. And so you get all these people that want to move towards a thing, but they're like, I'm not going to move towards a thing with this person because they're this, or I'm not going to move towards a thing with this person because they're this. And it's like at the end of the day, we're all part of like the black experience, right? Whether you agree with like my lifestyle or not, and it is my lifestyle is my own. So I don't even understand sometimes why it's a relevant conversation to judge the different groups. It gets in the way. And I think that plays when we look at it trickling down into the family as well. There's so many things where we have negative emotions towards a person, or maybe we don't agree with this other person's thing. And so we have different people in the family unit learning a skill, and not passing it down because they haven't gotten past their grievances with respective others. And when I say family unit, I don't necessarily mean relatives. I just mean anyone that you would consider like family, because I don't think that always has to be a blood thing. And there's like a level of acceptance as well, where let's say I have a cousin that has been assaulted by somebody in the family unit, and they have healed, and they want to teach me something about healing. But let's say I don't believe their story. Now there's a barrier, right? Because I can't separate from this idea that this other family member did like this horrendous thing. So there's like a lot of what I would consider lack of acknowledgement for people's grief within our community, right? It's like you have to fit this specific narrative for your grief to count and for it to be valid. Otherwise, it's like, okay, like you're just doing this other thing. Like I think about the way that we often, Black women have say so much that is useful to Black men in regards of how to interact with y'all. And then so many of us just be like, nah, that's not a real thing. Or nah, you made that up. Or nah, you're trying to be divisive. You're trying to separate us. And it's just like, if there's a group of people who are being affected by a thing and they're telling you they're being affected by a thing, there's nothing to discuss. Listen to them. It's like that simple, right? And I think we have a problem listening to groups that we don't necessarily identify with. And it becomes toxic because those groups are still within the Black community. And it just I think essentially it just goes down to intersectionality and us not necessarily thinking it needs to be a thing when it does, because no one person holds one identity. And so therefore it's like, if I'm talking about the wellness of Black people, I need to accept all the people within Black people. Yeah.
Yeah, that I get that intersectionality is huge when it comes to, and as you indicated, no one person has one identity, and we fall in, all different groups. And again, you're absolutely right. When you don't acknowledge someone else's existence, then conflict occurs, and really you don't hear the other person, and you don't hear the other person because you don't respect the fact that they exist. And it makes me angry because that's the exact same thing we went through as a whole people.
Exactly.
It's like we are doing the exact same thing that we went through as the entire group. It was done to us, and we do it to ourselves when we begin to ignore the presence and acknowledging, as you said, other communities that exist within, the Black community. So that was number 2. So what do you think what's the third gem that you have for us?
So once we identify the trauma, once we figure out how to heal and turn it into a practice, I think the next step is just about, I guess what would be the final step, since we said 3, would just be about intentionality. And what I mean by that is that I think sometimes we don't we aren't as diligent as we should be in relationship building, right? Where we could work so hard at a job for some other person and make them money. Of like, I did the math one time before I left my 9 to 5 and like started doing poetry full time. I was like, I'm here 8 hours a day, and this is essentially like, once you break it down, this is essentially like a third of my life. So a third, if I work this job till I die, a third of my life was dedicated to some person I never seen, who was most likely white. And it's just like, what does that do for me, and what does that do for my community, right? And so, but we still like grind it out, right? It's like, oh, you gotta go, you gotta get it, da 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 da, grind mode. And it's like, we should take that same mentality and apply it to relationship building. We don't prioritize each other enough, right? Like, we prioritize all these materialistic things. We prioritize like being financially stable. We prioritize all these things that essentially, I feel like, if you are spiritually grounded and if you are being the best version of yourself at all times, I feel like all the materialistic stuff will come regardless, right? But there needs to be more of a concern and more of a prioritization of people like us. And that doesn't even have to be like, that doesn't mean that you gotta always do the emotional labor of the entire community. It doesn't mean that you have to extend yourself to 3,000 people all the time. It could start as small as you putting time into 2 people that you really care about, or being intentional about making time for these 3 people that you really care about. Because you could do all the healing that you want to do, but if you don't have anybody to share it with, then essentially it's a wasted effort, right? Like, okay, you healed or are in the process of healing while everybody around you is still burning down. And so, once you identify the trauma, once you figure out how to put it into practice, you just have to be intentional about building the relationships in order to spread the healing in itself. And it doesn't even always have to be like, oh, I learned this thing, so here's this thing for you to learn from me. It could be as simple as 2 people, having a conversation about the different ways they found to heal themselves, and they each taking something respective from that interaction. Because there's so much that I have just by way of caring about people. And I'm not, like, my friends will tell you, I'm not a people person, right? Like, I don't like people in a general sense, because I feel like, the average person is like fully conditioned, and that comes with like so many things. But I like sharing energy. I like vibes, and I like connection. And I think there's so much that I've learned about myself by way of connection, right? Like, life is not a vacuum. Life is not a bubble. So you can learn a lot on your own, but essentially you won't fully get the big picture until you start connecting. And that looks different for everybody, but whatever connection looks like for you, I think it has to happen to some degree.
Oh, there you go. I think connection is something that is so key. And sometimes when we're dealing with things, especially after you healed for something, you're recovering for something, you're tired. Like you're really, really tired. And I am a person, I am an introvert, even though people don't believe that about me because they see me a lot. But I'm like, no, I really am. I am a hardcore introvert. And I'll stay by myself and I'll be in this thing, because sometimes when I come out of something, I'm just tired. But it's those connections and trying to build relationships that really build me up, build me back up and make it possible for me to go and do like, okay, let me start a live stream series. I can do this. Let me start another platform. I can do this. Let me go to work. I can do this. And I think sometimes we put building relationships last because some of us have been burnt by people and we don't trust in relationships anymore. And that's relationships across the board, romantic relationships, friendships, dealing with church folk. Um, so what do you do when it's key for the emotional wellness of not just you but your people, and you've lost that trust in building relationships, and we know how important support is.
Mm.
you know how do you navigate through that, because that is tough.
Yeah.
That is tough, and that can prevent you from taking that next step that needs to happen in building. And we talk about how, as we conversate and how as we share with one another, that's how the community heals. But what happens if you felt like the community hurt you and
Yeah.
you don't want to talk to the community?
And I think in identifying, if because I think we've all been to some extent damaged by the community, right? Like we started off talking about structural oppression and all the ways that forces act on us, but essentially being a part of those forces causes us to act on each other, right? And so there's I think tons of ways that we have hurt ourselves, because we're people at the end of the day. And I think that there needs to be an honesty about these things. And going back to the idea of vulnerability, there needs to be a vulnerability about these things, and we have to get to a point where first and foremost, we're okay saying to ourselves that we were hurt by this thing, right? Like it's not a weak sentiment to be able to admit that, like, okay, this person did this thing and it hurt me, no matter how small it is, because microaggressions can build up the same way big situations can. um and we then, after identifying it and being honest with ourselves, we have to be honest with the other parties, right? And then there are some communities that we just have to realize we can't be a part of in a certain capacity, right? Like you brought up the church, and I think that the church is a source of a lot of pain for people in the Black community for different reasons, right? And I specifically am not a person who is like religious. I believe in God, I believe in Jesus. I just don't claim like a religion. And so by way of that, I know that there are certain people I can interact with and it'd be fine. Like, cause I don't have any problem with Christians, but there is like a system as well. Like the church is part of a system. And so identifying that, okay, I can interact with people, but I may not need to interact with the system in this way that people are telling me I need to interact with it. I think that everything is about balance and discernment and identifying how much you can take of a thing and how much you can't, and being real with yourself about that and being real with the people around you about that. There are plenty of times where I may be in a depressive mood and, I'm just real with my homies. Like, yo, I can't talk right now. And it doesn't have anything to do with you. It doesn't have anything to do with, me not wanting you to be in my space, but I just don't have the energy. And, some people may find that difficult to accept at first, but if you are steadfast in that, I think that the people who should be around you will remain around you, and the people who shouldn't will fall off.
I think that's just key. And I think we're gonna have to do a whole nother I'm gonna have to do a whole nother live stream when it comes to the church. I think I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna bring you back. I'm gonna bring you back on that one. I'm gonna have you and a couple of other people, because we don't that topic keep coming up. So we're gonna do that one. We're gonna break all that one down all the way down. But in closing, um What would you say to a person right now and they are feeling, because I always ask, all of my speakers, when a person is right now and they're looking at the things that have happened, not just to them, but to their family. They see this generational trauma. They see the things that are taking place around them. If you could tell them one thing to just get them moving in a direction, what would that be?
If I could tell them one thing, it would probably be that. Well, I got two things. All right. So if we're specifically talking about family in regards to relatives, and I say this to my mom all the time actually, is that blood doesn't mean anything at the end of the day, right? You choose your family. And I wholeheartedly believe that. Can't nobody tell me anything that makes me think any different. Just because we happen to be born in the same gene pool, it literally means exactly that. It just means that we were born in the same gene pool. But it does not mean that I have to keep you around. It does not mean that I have to maintain a relationship with you if you prove to me that you are detrimental to my well-being. So first and foremost, I would say, like, you choose your family. You don't got to be around nobody you don't want to be around. You don't got to talk to nobody you don't want to talk to. All of that is optional, regardless of if somebody tells you it's not, it is, because you dictate your life. Secondly, going along with like this theme of dictating your life, anything within you that you think is natural or instinct can be changed, right? Humans operate a lot like computers in the regard that, like, if we do something long enough, it can become second nature. And we often talk about social conditioning, but we can also condition ourselves. And so if you have habits that, if you step back and look and they have not benefited you in the long run, you can change those habits regardless of where they come from, right? I used to have a severe alcohol problem, right? I've been sober for about like 8 months now, which is cool. And it's like, I used to think that that was ingrained in me. My great grandfather used to drink a lot. A lot of my uncles drank a lot. And it's like, at the end of the day, no, it's not. I can do something about that, right? Like, I used to have a temper when I was young. I used to get in a lot of fights in middle school, and a lot of people told me that I was just an angry child, right? But I could do something about that. I'm such a calm person now. And it's like, all of these things that we deem second nature can be shifted. We just have to we have to be honest with ourselves and willing to do the work to shift them.
I love that. I love that. I love that, being honest with yourself and doing the work to shift it. So I want to thank you so much for coming on tonight, Mr. Enoch the Poet. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us on the live stream. If you're just tuning in, be sure to catch the replay, which will be available in probably about 5 minutes. Enoch, can you tell us where we can find you if we are looking for you on social media or the internet?
Yeah, so my official website is www.enochthepoet.com. On there, you can find poems that I have published on different websites and different magazines. You can find video footage of me performing. There is a tab at the top that says purchase my book, that will take you to a link where you can get the guide to drowning. And that is, it could be a physical copy or it could be a digital copy, PDF. There's also a tab at the top that says purchase clothing, because I do have a clothing brand. I have a group of t-shirts and hoodies that say I'm a person, not a product. And so you can cop those. And I'm at Enoch the Poet on all social media. So Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, it's all under the same thing, because I feel like that just makes it easier.
That is also awesome. And again, we want to say also congratulations on 8 months. Keep growing, my brother.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations, you got this. You
Thank you.
got this. And I again appreciate you coming on and just sharing your wisdom and who you are and the things that you do with us. And I would like to thank everyone who has tuned in tonight. Be sure to catch us next week at the same time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, for another episode of the live stream wellness series with Laqwanda's Heart. We will have another special guest. Be sure to check out Enoch the Poet on all platforms, as he said, and to visit his website and to cop that book. I'm telling you, I heard this man. I have heard this man. He is fire. He is most definitely fire. But thank you guys. And be sure to catch me also and a group of 5 dynamic women on Healing Black Women on Instagram and Facebook, where we offer daily inspiration to those who are seeking wisdom on financial advice, um, life coaching, physical wellness, emotional wellness, mental health. We cover it all. So be sure to catch us every day for today's conversation. And again, thank you guys for joining us. Bye.